I'm Molly Cerrone, an acquisitions editor here at HEP, and I'm delighted to introduce you all to Julie Park, the author of Race, Class, and Affirmative Action, College Admissions in a New Era. Julie is a professor of education at the University of Maryland, College Park. She has extensive experience researching race and diversity in higher ed with a special focus on college admissions. In fact, she served as a consulting expert in the landmark lawsuit Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard on the side of Harvard. Her most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, addresses the implications of that Supreme Court ruling. Her other books are Race on Campus, Debunking Myths with Data, also from Harvard Education Press, which tackles misconceptions about how race and diversity work in college admissions and campus life. And she's also the author of When Diversity Drops, Race, Religion, and Affirmative Action in Higher Education. Julie co-directs the College Admissions Futures Collaborative, where she examines the impact of test optional policies and the future of college admissions. This work is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Besides publishing widely in academic journals and books, Julie also contributes to the Chronicle of Higher Ed, Inside Higher Ed, and the Washington Post, so you may have seen her writing in those outlets before. It's also an honor to introduce our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome OiYan Poon, co-director of the College Admissions Futures Collaborative. Her research focuses on the racial politics of Asian Americans, education access, affirmative action, and admissions systems and practices. She's the author of Asian American is Not a Color, Conversations on Race, Affirmative Action, and Family, published by Beacon Press. And she's a co-editor of Rethinking College Admissions, Research-Based Practice and Policy, published by Harvard Education Press. And also Difficult Subjects, Insights and Strategies for Teaching About Race, Sexuality, and Gender. Please feel free during this webinar session to add questions via the Q&A function. I'll break back in at the end to ask some questions from the audience. But for now, I'll turn it over to OiYan and let her kick off the conversation with Julie.
Yeah, thank you. Super excited to be here, be part of this webinar conversation. Since this book is so hot off the press, I'd like to invite Dr. Park to offer a quick synopsis, a little summary about this really fun book that I will say I have compared parts of it to the most fun parts of watching Real Housewives episodes. Um, and Julie was like, it's not that bad. I'm like, it's not bad at all. It's actually amazing. So if you like kind of little salacious tidbits about the admissions world, this is your book, but I will let Julie characterize and summarize her book for you all first.
That's right. This like book goes in and out of space depending on where I put it. All right. Thank you so much, Oyan. I will say I have never actually watched an episode of The Real Housewives, but I am fascinated with Dr. Wendy, who appeared, I believe, on The Real Housewives of Potomac, and she's an academic, and so it's really interesting. Okay, so yes, this is the webinar. This is like the behind the scenes. Oyan has known me for a really long time, literally decades. And so we're going to have a fine talk today. But just to give a little bit of context for people who have not read the book or just don't know very much about, or who would like to know more, it's a book that I use to argue that contrary, of course, 2023 was a difficult time. 2026 is a difficult time. 2025 was a really difficult time. And I think we're all still recovering while we're having to endure what we're going through in 2026. But you may have remembered the headlines, back in 2023, things like affirmative action is dead, Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action, etc. And like with many things, there's a kernel of truth, but then the reality is also more complicated. So in this book, I argue that race-conscious admissions is severely curtailed and restricted, but it is not dead, right? And I think that difference matters. First, there's a really big difference between being dead versus having some life, even if it is not, the most ideal situation for the policy, but also, for the trickle down effects and what, this court case, SFFA, has taken on more life beyond admissions, beyond what I think many of us anticipated or even thought was possible back in 2023 before the Trump 2.0 administration. So I think it's important for us to hang on, even though it really does feel like a thread of what the ruling does say is permissible in higher education, to still hang on on to that chunk of race consciousness or race sensitivity that was even recognized in the majority opinion to be able to push back against the interpretation that the Trump administration has imposed to really weaponize this ruling and to use it to go after everything. And I mean everything related to race in higher education and not even race, like things that are even on face value race neutral and class based. So with that, the book highlights the evolution of race conscious admissions policies over the years, and I highlight how, we sometimes forget that in previous court cases, there were versions of race conscious admissions that now seem pretty rigid to us today, but that were struck down and rejected and by the court. And so, for instance, in the Michigan cases, Michigan, you hear, oh, Grutter, allowed race conscious admissions to continue. But what people don't always realize is that in the companion case, right, that the court struck down Michigan's policy of giving students a specific number of points for being of a particular background, right? So, the most recent case at Harvard and UNC is another huge step in the evolution and really, I would say, unfortunately, the regression of these policies. But at the same time, a certain amount of race consciousness still does exist. And so I unpack that. I unpack like, what did the ruling actually say? What did it not say, right? There are a lot of misconceptions about what it said about Asian Americans. And I actually highlight how the majority was much fuzzier on that issue or kind of sidestepped the issue. I talk about that tools that campuses can still use to pursue diversity, and then tools that they probably should not use because the research doesn't support them. So, for instance, things like lotteries. I tackle the standardized testing debate. I joke that when I started in the initial stages of writing this book, I thought my biggest problem was when in 2024, Opportunity Insights rolled out a lot of research that contributed to the IBs going back to requiring standardized tests. And so then I had to rewrite that chapter. And so there's a lot on Opportunity Insights and their work. And I offer critiques. I think there are a lot of great things in their work, but in terms of the policy implications, I argue that it's not necessarily clear cut that the research that they did should automatically lead to institutions thinking that they have to go back to tests. So in that chapter, I try to show the gray and the complexity of the research, both on testing and then test optional that our team has continued to do. I highlight inequality in other parts of the application, so things like essays, extracurricular activities, etc. And then I talk about implications for campus life. And so I wrote it purposefully in a conversational tone. It's it's academic. I said it contains what I think is almost everything you need to know following the ruling, right? But then at the same time, I wanted a wide variety of people to read it, everyone from, researchers, policymakers, students, and families who just want to understand the admissions landscape more. And I even highlight things that people might not be aware of, that there are remaining legal options to defend race-conscious admissions. Whether any institution would be brave enough to actually take those on, I don't know. But I was surprised. Like it was something that I didn't know until I actually wrote the book. And so I imagine that readers might find some of the things surprising. And so even though it's a very dire landscape, I will not deny that. There was also a lot in the book that still gave me hope, right? That as I was, wrapping things up in late 2025 and the situation is just so terrible, right? So terrible across higher education. But it's also terrible because they want us to think it's even worse than it is. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is really bad. But I think there's a lot of gaslighting around what the ruling says. And I wrote this book, it kind of took on new significance as I was wrapping it up in late 2025 to say this can, offer some clarity against the gaslighting to highlight what should be happening, what the law actually says, and hopefully offer hope and inspiration for people working in this space and even students who want to understand things better. And so with that, OiYan,
Yeah.
is that good for an overview?
I think that's great. I know we had prepared some questions, but before we get to those, I actually
Yeah.
want to just riff with you a little bit. And as Julie said, we have known each other so long that we were actually roommates
Hmm.
in grad school, and we used to joke and have a little. I think we might have put up like a little paper on our door to our apartment that said like research center. So look at this, we're living our dream. Dream big dreams, and things can happen. Um, so you ran through kind of the arc and what the book contains. And I really appreciate, you do offer critiques about opportunity, insights, and I think it's what even is more interesting is the questions you offer to question, relationships and the behind the scenes, right, of opportunity, insights, and offering a lot more insights. And I know that you say, you're drawing a lot from a Chronicle article, which is great. And so I bring this up just to say like the readability piece is, really kudos to you for the readability. I really enjoyed reading this, like I said. There were parts of it that felt a little reality TV show like for me, and that opportunity insights part of it was definitely the reality show portion of
So maybe
things.
we should explain to our television viewing audience and
Yes.
webinar viewing audience at home or in your offices. Um, so I draw on so before diving into the actual research, I highlight a great article that was written by, I think, Francie Dieppe and also Nell Gluckman of the Chronicle. And the headline is basically like, does Raj Chetty practice what he preaches? Or I forget, maybe it was, does Opportunity Insights practice what they preach? And so it unpacks, the rating criteria that they used for their pre-doc program prior to 2021. And in it, they mentioned that like people would get points for like, and I think this is before they interview you. I forget, but this is to even get an interview. It's all in the Chronicle if you look at the archives. And of course, in chapter 4 of the book. And
Which was
so
great.
yeah, and so one of the metrics was so one was things like having perfect grades that gets you like 2 points. But another thing that got you 2 points was just coming from a college, like having graduated from a college that had I forget it was, I think mean or median, I don't remember, SAT math of like 790, 780 or above, right? So it's not even you. It's not even like what this person did. It's not even like your SAT score. I mean, I think if it was like you need a 1590 or 790 in math or something, clearly I did not get a 1590. Um, but it wasn't that. It was the institution that you come from. Like what, and because of that, you can imagine like only a relatively small handful of institutions qualified. And so when all of this came to light, so I thought the Chronicle did a great investigation on this. And so when all of this came to light, they said, we changed it. We like made things more flexible. So more institutions can qualify. And, just because like this point system is like a guide, it's not rigid, but I use that example to show like clearly like this group believes that testing has like some value, right? Has a lot of value, right?
Not
Um,
just any testing, a very
yeah,
specific
yeah, the
test,
SAT math,
right?
right? And so, and that's how they do things over there, and that is what it is. But I just said like, let's not pretend we don't have worldviews. Like, let's not pretend we're blank slates on testing. We all have socialization experiences that lead us to, believe whether we see value in the test. And I say, I'm kind of a little all over the place, right? Like I personally tested well, kind of like by miracle. And then, other people, my partner tested well, like kids hopefully will test well. I don't know, right? So it's like the system is work. I understand, and I do feel like the system works in our favor, right? And I understand why people, do see value in the test. But at the same time, right, it's impossible to work in higher ed and not know so many brilliant people who will just say, like, I didn't test well, right? And that does something it's
That's
done something. Yeah,
me.
you. I lived with this person who did not get a 1590 or 1600. Just kidding.
Not even close.
Yeah, right. And so it just makes you see. So, and it makes me wonder. It's not like Ross Shetty and those people. I mean, I hope they interact. I don't know. Maybe economists don't own it like the way people in education do, or people. I mean, it's definitely just a different field for many reasons, and then also in the composition of who it attracts, right? And so, um, So I
different
don't know.
paradigm.
So I say, I do, we've done this work around test optional, and I don't see really like any reason to mass discontinue test optional, right? I think it should be in general, like either institutional specific, or as far as I've seen, as I've seen, like I think there's a decent amount of support for it. But if I saw like if we do see like everyone's, academic performance like tanking, and we could specifically tie it to that policy and not something else like the pandemic, then I would say, okay, like let's rethink things and let's look at the big picture, right? Um, yeah, so I go back and forth, but I think I think we would be a little deluded if we didn't think that we didn't have prior life experiences that influenced how we think about the test.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think with everything in admissions, what you're kind of highlighting is how context matters and context
Mhm.
changes. And, that can be context of an institution and its mission, or context of the world we're living in, like during COVID and um, all these different things. So, kind of shifting a little bit, I just got off of a phone call. Some of what I'm doing these days is really looking at the confusion that has resulted from, the weaponization of the SFFA ruling, and, all the things that Trump 2.0 has been doing to further confusion about what colleges and universities can do to meet a public mission. And I really appreciate how in the book I think it's chapter 6, where you talk about the implications for student life, campus life, but also what institutional leaders can continue to do. And I so appreciate that you open your remarks and your summary of the book with, hey, people, affirmative action is actually not dead, right? There's still, and I think what's clear through the book is you reiterate that there's still a lot that can be done. But now, I think what it raises for me is like, is there a leadership imperative? Are people really like taking that up? Or are they just like following that fearfulness of, oh, we don't want to get sued. We don't have the resource to be sued or to engage in litigation. Um, but beyond that, what are some like tangible examples that you can share about in terms of what colleges and universities can continue to do, whether that's within admissions or outside of it? Because we know there was the Dear Colleague letter last year. Now there's attacks and questions around certification for grants and all these awful things that we're not, neither of us are lawyers, but we know that colleges and universities can still continue doing things, and there's the politics of it all and there's the legalities of it all. Um, can you share some things that colleges and universities can and should continue to do for their moral and, I think, connectedly, their fiscal imperatives?
Yeah. I mean, first, they should still talk about race, right? Because that's the First Amendment, right? It's like, if we're not going to use that, like, we've lost so much, right? Just to be unapologetic and still naming it. And maybe you're not like hitting people over the head, but to not, you can just kind of tell how people are being sort of race evasive, right? In the language and the sidestepping and whatnot. Um, and I understand they do want to stay under the radar. But so in terms of what they can do, right? Sometimes actions maybe speak louder than words. I mean, like Yale, I think still has the like for instance, like the multicultural open house fly-in program, right? It's open to everyone. You can bet, I'm sure their legal team was all over it, right? Scrutinizing it to make sure that it's still is still safe, right? And it is. It's open to all students, and it's just like, hey, come and see this part of campus that is very relevant, right? Institutions can still certainly, I think the most kind of comfort area is for them to talk about economic diversity, right? And of course, economic diversity warrants a lot of attention, needs a lot of attention, and needs a lot of investment. We know that investments in economic diversity will generally lead to or not always actually even. It might lead to some racial ethnic diversity, but generally not at the levels that we saw with race conscious admissions. And sometimes you actually don't see, really any boost.
Mhm. Yeah, because race
So
and class is not the same, but there's some overlap.
yeah, yeah. And so, but I think, sorry, short crop. I think that's certainly an area that institutions need to go kind of all out in, if anything, because it's the right thing to do, right? And it's interesting in the book, I talk about how, there are programs that earlier that the higher ed community could critique because, they weren't as effective as race conscious admissions. But then at the same time, as Stella Flores, I really liked her phrasing. She said the counterfactual has changed, right? We don't, yes, we can compare, but it's like this, if this is all we got. And so I think it's interesting in the book to look at innovation in the area of how can maybe go to certain initiatives, but think about how can they be improved. So for instance, percent plans in Texas, and a few other places, not the same level, especially when accounting for population growth, right, of Latinx and Black communities in Texas, but better than nothing. And so I think it was Stella and her team, they did some interesting an interesting study of like what happens when you pair, like we assume, or I assume, right? It's easy to assume. Let's just say it's easy to assume. I think if you're coming from, say, like a upper middle class vantage, you're like, oh, guaranteed admission, right? Like top 10, like we're, of course, everyone's gonna go, But no, they don't go,
No.
right? You have all sorts
Yeah.
of young people who are like, I don't want to go there, or I don't, and now it's like top 6%, I know. And so they looked at, tested, the team at UT Austin, they tested some interventions that I thought were really interesting of what happens when you pair guaranteed admissions with sort of like more direct push out financial aid and, just more support. And they did see some benefits to that. So I think that's also a really interesting space, alongside it, efforts to just reduce friction in the financial aid arena, right? And so Michigan had previously the Hale Scholarship, and they took out the required proof of eligibility, right? So saying like, if you get this, and specifically targeting students who are in high schools with high free and reduced lunch, if you get this, you will get tuition covered, right? Versus, or sorry, if you get in to Michigan, you will get your tuition covered versus saying, if you get in and you file FAFSA and have your proof of eligibility confirmed, then you will get full tuition. And once again, to an upper middle class person, they're like, free tuition. How could anyone turn that down? But it's like, no, that's like a huge, FAFSA is a beast, right? And so efforts to reduce friction in the process are really good. And then lastly, this isn't necessarily like institution. Well, actually, it could be institution specific, but I have been citing this example all the time. I wish I had more examples to cite of people doing this in this space. But, in Wisconsin, the state attorney general, Josh Kaul, he, appealed this attack, right? Or this ruling that was trying to take down this race conscious retention grant in Wisconsin that was given to students largely in technical colleges. Not big bucks, but still like could make a huge difference in whether a student finished college. And I thought it was really great that they went to the Wisconsin, they're still, went to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court to argue to say SFFA doesn't apply to this policy. It's outside the scope. And anyway, we did try race neutral, alternatives. They didn't work. And so they did go to bat in terms of arguing to try to preserve this race conscious financial aid program, which I think is really great. So I would love to see more of that.
Yeah, definitely. Just a reminder to the audience, if you've got questions or comments, put them in the Q&A function. There's a button on the bottom of the screen. And shout out Dr. Pendacor. Sumi Pendacor says hello.
Ah, hi,
Um,
Susie.
Hi, Sumi. Yeah, so really excited to see some friends in the audience and And yeah, definitely use the Q&A function. The chat box is disabled for this session. So I'm just going to keep going with my questions and our conversation until I see something in the Q&A, or unless our colleagues here would like to chime in.
Yeah, I think you can keep going. I think Molly, at the last 10 minutes, she said she was going to do like open up
Great.
Q&A. So, yeah.
Great. All right. So I think this conversation gets to this question about what is the purpose of higher education. I know, whenever I've taught higher ed, it's always like the question always comes up. Whatever we're doing, our activities, our programs, initiatives, how does it tie back to the mission of higher education, the purpose and the goals? And I think that was definitely clear throughout the book as well, as like as things change and context changes and shifts and challenges appear. Um, how does it tie back to? I feel like a lot of this, like Trump 2.0 stuff and weaponization of SFFA, is like trying to knock higher ed off of its contemporary mission because we know that the mission early on was not that great and very exclusionary and racist and sexist and all the, isms. But what do you think in your mind the goals of higher ed should be, and how can post-secondary institutions today meet those goals in admissions and through other activities?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a big one, and this is just kind of rough
What
drafts.
is your big philosophy,
Big
Dr.
goal,
Park?
like how should higher ed, like what is higher supposed? I mean, I think higher ed, like one, and I don't think it has to be a singular goal, right? But I think a huge goal should be, to contribute to both human and societal flourishing right through, the support and promotion and advancement of, learning, knowledge, scholarship, research, all of those good things, right? Um, we're not like I'm thinking of like other alternative missions. I'm like, we're not like a factory making Legos, or we're not this, although someone might invent some really cool way to make Legos, right? But the thing that kind of ties us all together is like the like stuff that comes from here, right? And taking what's in here and the collaboration that comes when you bring people together to be able to yeah, to create, right? I think back to we're Bruins, UCLA alum, right? And so that Fiat looks, right? Let there be light, right? Like that there should be a role in bringing light, right, through, knowledge and advancement of understanding. And people address that through so many different angles, which is something I love about higher ed, like that you can have people in such just different fields, whether it's like humanities or medicine or, you know, all across the disciplines, who are just trying to kind of unearth, right, these insights in their own way and in their own context. And then ultimately to hopefully come back to help society, right, in one way or another. And so how should that influence how we think about admissions? And so I do talk about this in the book, particularly in the conclusion, right? And I kind of loop it back to in some ways to the testing debate, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if the purpose of higher ed is to raise the next cohort of, workers for McKinsey, then the admissions metrics will look one way. But last time I thought or checked, that no one said that was higher ed's mission, not officially. Once again, actions sometimes speak louder than words, and the way, which is where I think we have some misalignment, right? Sometimes with what actually goes on certain campuses versus what we say. And it would be great to like get everyone like really be like, mission, are we on mission? And some places I'd be like, no, I don't think we're on mission as much as we should be, right? But if you are to say, no, I don't think it's just to get people to identify the talent pool for McKinsey, like let McKinsey do their own talent identification, but to bring up, right, to help support the advancement of human flourishing in society. And that means all parts of society, right? And that means all populations, right? And so, as many have argued before, like that is only possible when you get people from all different walks of life to the fullest extent and bring them together, right? Because, we know that we have a different type of educational experience when just people are so different, right? Um, and at higher ed, of course, not perfect. And even before 2023, right, there are all sorts of, it's implementing this idea in practice is, moving from lofty idea to reality on the ground is really difficult, right? But I think we have to try, and we try to the best of our ability. And so, yeah, so I think, in some part, higher ed, as you've written about so well, Oyan, is juggling all these competing institutional priorities. But I think mission, right? These aspects of mission should be really driving the ship, or at least like in the front, right? And so thinking of, that we need to have admission, that in the admissions process, we think of, a student's potential contributions both to the campus community and to society, right? And to think about how some of the things that we're looking for are going to go beyond just grades and test scores, or especially test scores, I think. Um, and so, yeah, so it lends itself to this messy, holistic system that we have in the United States, which is not perfect. I think we both know it's broken in a lot of ways. And I think this is your next question, resulted in a lot of like perverse incentives, right?
Yeah.
But I think the basic idea of we are going to look some beyond just these more rigid metrics is really important because it's necessary to meet that mission and to bring students from a wide array. And of course, it's not just prior to 2023, it wasn't just race, ethnicities. It's even things around like major, right? And like what your intended career goal. Like, does it make sense to have the whole first year class? Like, you're a very different first year class if you decide, okay, we're just going to fill it with chemical engineers, right? And love chemical engineers, right? But do you want your whole, but some of these schools could easily fill like all chemical engineers, right? And it's just like, oh, that's a different experience than if we bring in people from, who want to study English or sociology or history or even just mechanical engineering, right? A
Yeah.
different type of engineering, right?
Like how
Really
does it connect, right, to the you have this picture behind you of,
oh yes, the
you
work,
know, right? Like it's much broader than like
yes,
who does well on these standardized tests that are super narrow and I think trains young people into this narrow understanding of flourishing or achievement, right? Yeah, so just speaking of perverse incentives, right? I think there is this culture around admissions, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I do watch these TikToks and Instagram video reels of like seeing what colleges I got into, and like I will confess I do love these videos of families celebrating their kids, but I'm like in the back of my mind I'm still like, ooh, this is totally feeding into this like only a few can be special and celebrated. And I loved this counter video this year of somebody celebrating their entry into community colleges. I'm like, yes, like let's do that, right? But there's all these influencers now around like, let's break down this person's application data
yeah,
and see why they got into, just speculate about why they got into X and not Y. And it's this really icky swamp right
yeah,
now around these incentives of like, middle class parents wanting to be able to put a fancy bumper sticker on their cars, but going to the mission versus institutional priorities on the institutional end, right? There's incentives around prestige, which requires like how many kids are you rejecting? Like, how is that connected to an educational mission and measurement of quality of education, right? Um, there's all kinds of funky and awful incentives around admissions, like, you know, donor admissions, student athletes, and prestige factors, and rejection numbers, and um, so if we're seeing these perverse incentives on both the institutional side and among students and their families and in our schools, what do you think are some ways to push back on these incentives or intervene and kind of maybe course correct a little bit? I know there's been experiments or trials in the past that, for better or worse, have resulted in changes over time, but wondering what you're thinking in this moment.
Yeah, it's really gotten ugly. I get those videos too. It's like the pain of being an admissions researcher, and then you get like the videos fed to you. And it's just, I don't know. Yeah, it's like a little dystopian, right? Sort of in this way where it's like everything is just manufactured in this, and the students, even the student who kind of just wants to do their thing, like I don't think they can run away from that pressure. And yeah, it's weird. I don't know, because I think back to when I applied to school in the late 90s, and you knew you wanted to, like, there's sort of a sense like, oh, like I need to do some things to try to look good, but I don't think just the pressure wasn't there in the same way that it is now. And I agree with the percentages going down so low, and then you have schools like for instance, like they'll try to get more applications. So they'll say no more supplemental essays, which I think is, in some ways it would be fine if they were cutting them for like a different reason. I do think like the supplements have become like its own beast and almost kind of undermine the purpose of Common App, right? Like, and so, yeah, like, and then like I read, recently I think it's WashU is offering early action now. And on face value, that sounds great. It's like, oh, so like better, right? Even though in the book I critique ED heavily and I say, but EA is not perfect. EA is better, but has its own, is plays some role in perpetuating inequality. But I'd rather have EA than ED, right? But WashU, which now has both, and people are like, oh, it's for two reasons. Like one is because for the EA, they try to like they'll defer you and they'll be like, but we heavily encourage you to resubmit this application ED2, right? Early decision round two, right? And so that's like manipulative. But then the other reason is because you have, schools like Harvard, Yale, et cetera, that have single choice or restrictive early action. And underneath though that policy, you can't apply anywhere else ED, but I think yeah, you can apply places EA. Actually, I'm not sure if you can apply private EA. I would have to double check that. But if you can, people are saying, oh, that's also like strategic because then a student will be like, oh, I could apply to Harvard or Yale single choice, but then I could also add WashU,
Yeah.
for the ones that allow for a private EA. So this is the games, like this is where we are, where it's like if you're not already an expert in this, or if you're not like a consultant, like it's just this is why people hire consultants, right? To try to get through this. And so yeah, and in the book I talk about, just there's so many ripple effects for just the negative, all of this like how out of control it's gotten. I have these undergrads, and when you ask them how admissions was, they're like, I'm still burnt out, right?
Yeah.
And that's not good. We don't want students like coming to college feeling burnt out. Like you're just supposed to be getting started, right? Um, and you have, I even think, it's like, eh, I was talking, even my mom, right? My 78-year-old mom wants to know why admissions feels like all sorts of nutty. And I was explaining to her, she's like, oh, it's like Korea. And I was like, yeah, it is becoming more like Korea. I was like, but we don't want that either. Cause like in Korea, no one wants to have kids or no one wants to have more than one kid because it is so exhausting and costly to raise a child in that environment. And so I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to join forces with the pro-natalist movement, but maybe like maybe that could be like a interest convergence to try to like reduce the nutso-ness in
Yeah.
admissions because like I don't think it's like in the long run, like it just doesn't make for a good life. So anyway, what can we do? Like how can we uh, move from perverse incentives to like better incentives, like to make like to help
Mhm.
incentivize towards sanity, right? And
Please.
so yeah, so I mean, we did research on extracurricular activities, and from there, like, I do think, like, because I was looking at an application to the other day, I was like, 10 activities? Like, that's a lot. Like, even if everyone doesn't fill them all out, students feel the pressure, right? I think that's one where it's just like, just bring it down to five or something like that. Just give these
Mean like
students
limiting students to like you can put in five.
yeah, yeah, I think that would go along. I think it would go away. It could go some way towards reducing just like a little bit of like the like how am I, going to get there? And just promote focus, right? And some of the things that we say we want, to encourage. In a magical world, I would get rid of early decision. I don't think that's possible, but maybe that just needs to be a commission, on its own, just like
Yeah.
from NACAC or something like I don't know if it's reforming or rethinking early admission process to promote sanity. Like, what is the
Yeah.
goal? Sanity, right? Or it would be interesting to see, like, could there be some sort of, I mean, I don't think colleges would do this because they use ED for yield and all of that. But maybe if like
Gotta
Harvard
make
and
the
all,
class.
yeah. So like, what if you had like you can only apply ED if you're from a certain income bracket, right? Because, they will justify ED by being like, but Questbridge, right? It's like, okay, well, then let's just keep ED if your income is below this level, right? Um, I think that's interesting because there's nothing in the law that says like you can't have different hoops for people of different income levels. So I think playing with some of these policies, whether it's around testing or early decision or et cetera, and making just, making things easier for people who aren't in that top like 1-2%, I think, could be helpful. Another thing could just be like, what if we committed informally to capping the number of students who come from households from the 1%? Like,
Yeah.
we set target goals for Pell. People have set target goals for Pell enrollment, but it's like the other side, you have to address the other side of the coin, which is just this sheer overrepresentation of, the wealthiest families.
But
And
that does
so,
bring up the question of like, those students are admitted because they bring, right? What do they bring as contribution? Tuition dollars,
yeah, the money,
right?
right?
The money, the revenue, right?
Yeah.
And then you end up with this, what is that saying? No margin, no mission, which I think is also just really troubling.
Yeah.
Um, right. So I can hear some of the enrollment management leaders
Yeah.
in my head right now being like, well, how are we supposed to pay the bill? How are we supposed to get to the board has told us we need to meet X revenue goals and tuition needs to contribute X amount, right? Speaking of those perverse goals.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
when you have some, I mean, I don't know. I think there are more people. It's not a good thing, but I think there are more people who are willing to pay full price for some of these names beyond just the 1%. And so I think
Yeah.
even creating some more flexibility. So, but the way things work, it creams the 1%. And so, or it really does benefit the 1%.
They're so disproportionately
Mhm.
overrepresented
Yeah.
at these highly rejective fancy colleges that can afford to support, I think, the educational trajectories of so many more students. So speaking of this, like I'm like getting anxious, right? Like thinking about these perverse incentives, right?
Yeah.
And you and I are both moms now. Mine just turned 11. I
Wow.
forget how old yours are now, but a little bit
Yeah. Five
younger.
and eight.
5 and 8, it goes so fast. And I keep like, I have this mental countdown towards like, okay, this is how many years until we have to enter this madness of college going. And I'm trying to like, as a mom, try to like squash down a lot of this. I mean, I also live in Chicago, so there's the high school process that I won't get into, but my neighbors are like, "What'd you do, Chicago high schools? College is a cake." And I was like, "Oh my God,
Oh my goodness. That doesn't sound
terrifying."
good if it makes college look easy.
Yeah, knowing what we know, I'm kind of like, "Oh my God, I'm really scared now." But, so I'm wondering, as a mom and knowing perhaps too much, more than most moms know, like we do. How are you thinking about how you raise your kids, how you cultivate, and what kind of, you know, space you surround them by as they progress through K-12 towards this point of where we study?
Yeah, I would say they're like sort of two lanes, maybe that influence my parenting that they don't necessarily, they're like in tension with each other. And so, one is the good thing about being a college admissions researcher is that you really do know, I think you know more than the general public, just how many great schools there are that have admit rates of over 5%, right? So that's in some ways that's helpful. And so that does give me like a little like slight room to breathe. I think like because I'm like if I were a parent who was like, no, my kid needs to go to an Ivy, like that would just be miserable for everyone,
Totally.
right? That would just be miserable. So on one hand, there is that flexibility of just like, okay, like I would really like you to, UMD is great because it would be free tuition. I like drop hints to my kids here and there. And then like we live in Virginia actually, and they're great in-state schools here. Although there are some of them are really hard to get into. So I'm like, oh my goodness, I don't know if my kids can get into UVA or whatnot. But William and Mary is really good, also hard to get into, and Virginia Tech is really good, and even like College of Mary Washington or Mary Washington University, that's another good one that's easier to get into. So, all right.
I used to work at George Mason, so
That's right. And Mason, yeah, is also, has some really strong programs. So that's like one lane. The
yeah,
other lane is like, you know, it's funny because you asked me in the original question, like I think you used like the concerted cultivation term,
cultivation.
right? Which is from LaRue, right? And if you have not read the book, like she talks about like two forms of parenting where like lower SES working class tend to be like a natural growth, right? Which is like just a lot free range, right? Pretty free range versus the concerted cultivation, which is kind of like helicopterish or just like you're really like just thinking intentionally about like the choices that your kids, right? And it is my confession that we are so or I right I will not drag my husband into this. He actually would probably be more on the natural growth
Me and Dan,
side.
go Dan.
Yeah, but by my socialization, like I cannot help but in some ways be so committed to cultivating them that even the things that look like natural growth are in some ways cultivated.
Mm.
So, for
Mhm.
instance, I actually do make them play outside. Like, I don't overschedule them because, first of all, we fall apart, but then also because I know it's not good for them. And so, that in itself is an intentional choice, even though it looks like I'm chill, it looks like I'm chill. It's because I know that it's actually not good for
You
them.
know the research on child development.
Yeah, and I like throw them outside and then they play and they make these imaginary worlds and they wreck my lawn and everything. And that's an intentional, it's both lazy and intentional. So I was
Love
saying
it.
like lazy and intentional is
Both and live
my
it.
style. So kind of both and. So I think, yeah, so I can't help. I mean, like, yeah, I would not, yeah, like what Jay Caspian Khan calls the panicking class, right? Like, I can't help, like, I am a member, right? But I try to push back in some ways, if anything, because I know that some of the natural growth kind of style, like that approach of free range, is actually just really good for
Yeah.
kids. But they do other things. And it is funny because I do them because it's like not because I think you're going to be the best at them, but because I think they're good for them. So, for instance, like piano lessons, I never thought I was so bad at piano. And I never thought I would make my own children take piano lessons. And then it was just like this like biological impulse when my oldest turned 5 that they should try to take piano lessons. And there's so much yelling and screaming and wasting of money. But then he's actually like kind of getting the hang of it. And it's just like, oh, it's just good to have like to be able to read music. So it's like it's not like the like you're not going to be like Amy Chua kids or anything like that or anything close. But I'm like, but I'm doing this because I think it's actually just good for you to have music, like to learn music in this different way. And so what they'll become, I don't know, but they're pretty funny and they like to read. So they have that going in their favor.
Oh, love that. Hi, Molly.
Hi, I was just going to jump in with some questions from the audience, and this is great because that was a question someone asked about the
Oh,
balancing
yeah.
of parenting and being a practitioner. So that was really fascinating. And we sorry we probably won't get to all these questions. I'll try to combine a few because there are some similar ones. There are some people asking about reinstating test policies. There's questions about how likely do you think it is that universities are going to be reinstating their standardized testing requirements? And then for the universities that do, what can student affairs professionals do to advocate for students even when these policies, start to come back?
Yeah, Are they going to come back? Like there were some select schools, both mostly private and then a few public that have gone back. And then it's like a drip, drip. Like you'll hear of one state system. Like I think Louisiana State is going to go back. But we haven't seen this flood, right, of like big momentum, et cetera. And I think that's because institutions, a lot of them like test optional because more students apply, right? It converges with some of their other priorities for enrollment. And they are, worried about the whether you call it a cliff or what a cliff or decline, right, in the number of students enrolling. So I think they probably want to let students, cast the broadest net of applicants. And so because of that, I would be surprised if you saw like this tsunami going back. But I know that enrollment admissions people are experiencing pressures. Yeah, and so anything could happen, at some of the more elite schools that have kept test optional. I think it's a big question mark. But I do think some flexibility um, is helpful. And so, in terms of what people can do, well, that's interesting. If you read our new report, so we actually have a new report up on our website, CAFCOLAB, CAFCOLAB.org. Put it in the chat for everyone.
Keep talking, I'll find it.
Oh, okay. Um, we did, we have a new report on test optional at two selective state universities. And what's interesting is that one of the schools was test optional during the height of pandemic, but has since gone back to requiring tests. And so, what you can do, right? Or what, when you're in that and you're kind of mid-level, et cetera. I mean, I think it's on one hand, like you still could, I don't know if those schools would ever go back to test optional because it's kind of, although you never know, right? But we talk in the report about rethinking test optional for instance, if you had some of these elite schools say, well, some low-income students weren't submitting their scores under test optional. And it's like, well, you could keep test optional, but you could just provide more clear guidance around like whether you should submit scores or not and explain to students that scores are read in context of opportunity. You could provide little snippets, case studies to say, yeah, in this situation, we might recommend submitting your test scores, right? So that's one thing. But for, feeling at the school is like, okay, they've gone back to test required and they like it. I think it's similar to, prior to the pandemic, just really trying, right? I think to advocate for students when you see strengths, right, that go outside of the test score and to, help I know it's tricky or challenging, but right, to harness as much data as you can to be able to help, suggest, right, that the student is worth bringing in and will bring, and to maybe try to challenge teams to flip that conversation from, oh, what does this student not have to what is this student gonna bring? Like, why are we lesser off if we don't have students like these? I'll say whoever submitted that, feel free to email me because I'm also interested in just learning more about like what's going on in admissions offices, period. So feel free to reach out and email me, and I'd be curious to hear if there's something you want to talk about off the record.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. Also, staying on the practical side of what universities and the people who work there can do, someone else asks, is there a path to dispute the SFFA decision in California v. Bakke? Justice Powell upheld universities' right to shape their student body as a First Amendment right, which you mentioned earlier in this conversation. Is there a path to revisit SFFA as a First Amendment violation and regain institutional control over shaping their student body? And I'll just add, do you think that's likely that universities are going to do that right now?
Yeah, I don't think it's likely. Is it possible? Maybe. I don't know. Like, I'm not a lawyer, but it would be really interesting to talk to one. And I forget Kim Westfalcon, who's at Loyola Law, she's done the most writing so far on kind of like what are the alternative potential defenses of race conscious admissions after SFFA. And I forget how much she talks about First Amendment stuff, but I think it's relevant. In the book, I talk about a case called Croson v. City of Richmond, which Kim Westfalcon highlights in one of her articles as potentially providing a alternative legal defense of race conscious admissions. it's very interesting for a lot of reasons. So in Bakke, what the court struck down was, the when the University of California tried to argue in favor of its policy based on like widespread past societal discrimination. So that's called a remedial approach, right? You're looking back. And they said societal discrimination. And the court said no to that, right? And then that's what we ended up with Justice Powell's compromise and the Harvard plan until that too finally got struck down in 2023. However, there's this case from the 80s, Croson, where the court, responded to it struck down a race conscious plan and kind of in hiring in a different context, but it did give more leverage to the approach of justifying a race conscious program due to specific discrimination so remedying past discrimination, so it would be a remedial defense, but based on a specific entity's involvement in that discrimination, right? So instead of saying general past discrimination, like the UC did in Bakke, you would be just trying to say, we want to bring back race conscious admissions because our institution has this ugly history of discrimination in the past and da da da. And because of that, our numbers have always been really low and we need this intervention, right? In the book, I also talk about how it doesn't even have to be that direct. An institution wouldn't have to say, like, we are guilty. It could say, for instance, it could claim a loophole called passive participation. So it could say, we passively participated in something that led to our numbers not being so great. And because of that, we need this intervention of race conscious admissions. So it would be a different defense. Whether an institution would take it, I don't know, probably, in this political climate, probably not. But what I find really interesting about it is that, I mean, a lot of things, but one thing is that it would be sort of an institution specific, like I think the ruling would just either apply to that institution and institutions that were in the similar boat, right? So it would be a more targeted approach versus previous cases. The court was kind of like, okay, we like holistic race conscious, and now everyone can use it if they want. So it would be targeted. But I actually think that is appropriate or, maybe less than ideal than the old approach. But in the current era, it is appropriate because you do see some schools that are able to have a certain amount of racial ethnic diversity without race conscious admissions. And, if a school can get to that level, that's great, But for schools that are really finding like that they cannot, and they would also have to show that they've really exhausted all means. And I actually don't think many schools have done that. But say you have a place like MIT that doesn't consider legacy, that doesn't use early decision, etc., right? And has seen a really big hit to their numbers, right? And doesn't consider athletics. That's the other big thing. I don't think MIT has athletic teams, but I don't think there's a thumb on the scale for athletic recruitment there. So, that would be very interesting to say, like, hey, you actually do have an option to bring back. It would have to be institution specific, as far as I know. But read the book for
Got
more
it.
details.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think we're about to wrap up. We could squeeze in one more question. We
Yeah, sure,
can,
sure.
let's see. Yeah, yeah. So I'll scroll to the bottom. There's one on financial aid. What are your thoughts on the financial aid caps for all students and their impact on future professionals? And I know, Julie, in the book you talk about merit scholarships and things like that. So it would just be great to hear more about your perspective on financial aid.
Yeah, it's really messy. I mean, the main thing is you don't want it coming from the federal government. I mean, on one other hand, who's it ever going to come from? But, this is really stiff handing. I don't know if that's the right word, right? This is really curtailing, right? Institutional autonomy. And so, yeah, I do find them troubling because it's another example of overreach. And yes, there may be these just really detrimental effects of, who can afford then to go to these types of graduate schools? Well, people who can pay full flight or only have to take out limited loans. And in a dream world, maybe some of these actions would backfire and it would raise like a rally of resistance of people like reclaiming like education as a civil right and saying like, why can't the government just invest more in, in universities so we don't have to be like normalizing debt, right? And things like that. But that too, I don't know if is gonna happen. And so I'll just say, yeah, it's just another continuation of the current administration's overreach.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a great answer in a very short amount of time. Kept us on schedule. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Again, that slide had info about the book on it, and I guess we'll wrap up. Thank you, Maya, too, for organizing this.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Everyone have a great day. Thank you, OiYan.